December 24th, 1944, 23:45 hours, Camp Hearne, Texas. The silence of the barracks was a deception. Under the floorboards in the crawl space smelling of dry rot and Texas dust, Obergefreiter, Senior Lance Corporal Klaus Richter, held his breath. His fingers, calloused from weeks of picking cotton, trembled as they adjusted a copper coil wound around a toilet paper roll, a makeshift inductor. Above him, the heavy boots of an American MP thudded against the pine planks. Thump, thump, pause. Klaus squeezed his eyes shut. If they found the device, it wasn't just solitary confinement. It was the end of the fragile reality he had constructed. He adjusted the cat's whisker detector 1 millimeter to the left. Screech. Static hissed through the stolen earpiece, loud as a scream in his mind, though silent to the room above. Then, cutting through the Atlantic atmospheric interference, a sound defied the laws of war. A choir, singing in German, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. It was a ghost frequency, carrying a melody from a burning continent to the peaceful, frozen plains of Texas. Tears, unbidden and hot, pricked his eyes. "What's that noise?" The MP's voice muffled through the floor. Klaus froze. The wire, his lifeline, was suddenly a noose. If you enjoy historical stories like this, please subscribe and comment which country you're watching from. 3 weeks earlier, the Miller Farm, Brazos County. The canvas cover of the transport truck flapped violently, snapping like a whip against the steel frame. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and unwashed bodies. Klaus Richter sat near the tailgate, his eyes fixed on the receding cloud of red dust that marked their path away from Camp Hearne. He adjusted the collar of his denim workshirt. On the back, the letters PW were stenciled in bright white paint, a brand that transformed him from an Obergefreiter of the Luftwaffe into livestock. 20 minutes to the Miller place, whispered Hannes, a young infantryman sitting opposite him. I heard the old woman watches us like a hawk. Says we eat too much. Klaus didn't answer. He was watching the Texas landscape roll by. Flat, brown, and endless. It was a cruel geography. In France, a man could run and find a hedgerow, a cellar, a resistance line. Here there was only horizon. The truck lurched to a halt. "Rouse! Everybody out!" the American sergeant bellowed, banging his baton on the metal side. They spilled out into the yard of the Miller farm. It was a modest operation, weathered by the Dust Bowl years and the war. A tractor sat rusting near the barn, its engine cowling removed, exposing the mechanical guts. Klaus's eyes lingered on it. He felt a phantom twitch in his fingers, the itch of a technician denied his tools. Strictly speaking, as a non-commissioned officer, Klaus wasn't required to work under the Geneva Convention. But the alternative was the barbed wire disease, the creeping madness of the barracks where men argued over inches of sleeping space. He chose the fields. "All right, Fritz," the farmer, Mr. Miller, pointed a calloused hand toward a pile of debris behind the main house. "Clear that trash before you start on the fencing. Burn what burns, bury the rest." Klaus nodded stiffly. He moved toward the heap. It was the refuse of a life interrupted by war. Broken furniture, twisted chicken wire, and shattered glass. Then he saw it. Half buried under a stack of wet newspapers was a wooden cabinet. The veneer was peeling, and the front grille was smashed, but the shape was unmistakable. A Philco cathedral-style radio. Klaus knelt, his heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. He glanced over his shoulder. The guard was lighting a cigarette, looking away. Klaus reached into the debris and turned the radio around. The back panel was missing. Inside, covered in dust and spider webs, sat the vacuum tubes. 3 of them were shattered, but two were intact, and the copper coil of the tuner was unbent. To Mr. Miller, this was trash. To Klaus, staring at the intricate geometry of the filaments. It was oxygen. It was a voice. It was the first dangerous thought he'd had in 6 months. The transport truck ground its gears and hissed to a halt before the double-gated entrance of Camp Hearne. The sun was low, casting long, jagged shadows of the barbed wire across the dust. Klaus sat perfectly still. Against his ankle, tucked inside the coarse wool of his sock and padded by a stolen rag, he felt the cold, smooth glass of the 2 vacuum tubes. They were fragile as eggshells. One wrong step, one heavy hand during the pat-down, and they would shatter, slicing his skin and sealing his fate. "Line up, intervals," the MP barked. It was Sergeant Davis. Davis was not cruel, but he was meticulous. Today, he wasn't just waving them through. He was checking pockets. Klaus stepped down from the truck, the dirt crunching under his boots. He focused on his breathing. In, out. The fear was different now. It wasn't the paralyzing dread of the bombardment at Normandy. It was a sharp, electric current. For the first time in months, he had a mission. He wasn't just prisoner 43109. He was an operative. The line shuffled forward. Hannes was directly in front of him. "Empty your pockets," Davis ordered the man ahead of Hannes. He pulled out a half-eaten apple and a carved wooden figure. Davis tossed the apple into a bin, but returned the carving. Klaus calculated the timing. He needed a diversion. He tapped Hannes on the shoulder, a subtle, rhythmic tap they had used in the signals regiment. Attention. Hannes stiffened, then imperceptibly nodded. As he stepped up to Davis, Hannes fumbled with his shirt pocket. He pulled out his booklet of canteen coupons, the script used to buy toothpaste and soda within the camp. "Careful there, Fritz," Davis grunted. Hannes's hand spasmed. The booklet flew open, scattering the small paper coupons into the dust and the mud near the guard's boots. "Verdammt!" Hannes cursed, dropping to his knees, scrambling frantically to gather the camp currency. "My cigarettes! Sorry, Sergeant, sorry!" Davis sighed, annoyed, and stepped back to avoid having his polished boots scuffed by the groveling prisoner. "Get up! Move it!" In that chaotic second, Davis's eyes were fixed on Hannes's hands. Klaus saw the gap. He stepped forward, not too fast, his face a mask of bored exhaustion. He kept his gait even, forcing his muscles not to limp despite the glass pressing against his ankle bone. He walked right past the focal point of the search. "Next!" Davis yelled, distracted, waving Klaus through to deal with Hannes. Klaus passed the inner gate. The heavy thud of the iron latch closing behind him usually sounded like a prison sentence. Tonight, it sounded like a vault locking him in with his prize. He walked to the barracks, his pulse thumping in his ears. He had the heart of the machine. But as he sat on his bunk and carefully unwrapped the tubes, the victory soured. They were just glass and filament. Without wire for coils and a power source, they were nothing but dangerous souvenirs. The barracks smelled of stale tobacco, sweat, and the damp wool of drying uniforms. While the other men played scat or argued over the rumors of the Ardennes offensive, Klaus sat on his lower bunk, his workspace defined by the shadow of the upper mattress. He needed a capacitor. Without it, the radio was just a collection of parts that could receive nothing but static. He looked at the pack of cigarettes Hannes had dropped earlier. Rallies. The Americans wrapped them in a thin layer of aluminum foil backed by paper. It was garbage to them, but to a radio operator, it was conductive gold. "Got a smoke?" Klaus asked quietly, leaning toward Hannes. Hannes looked at him suspiciously, then tossed the crumpled pack onto the blanket. "Take the last one. I'm sick of the taste." Klaus took the cigarette but didn't light it. Instead, he carefully peeled the foil liner from the pack. He smoothed it out on top of his footlocker, using the back of his thumbnail to iron out the wrinkles until the sheet was perfectly flat. He did the same with a second pack he had scavenged from the trash bin near the mess hall. Next came the insulator. He pulled a piece of wax paper, saved from a cheese ration, from under his pillow. With surgical precision, Klaus layered the foil and the wax paper. Foil, paper, foil, paper. He rolled them tightly into a cylinder, binding it with a scrap of thread pulled from his blanket. It was crude, ugly, and fragile. But if his physics were correct, it would hold a charge. "What are you building, Richter?" The voice came from the bunk across the aisle. It was Feldwebel, Sergeant Muller, a hardliner who still polished his boots as if inspection were due by the Führer himself. Klaus didn't look up. He kept his hands steady, twisting two bare copper wires, stripped from a discarded bootlace eyelet, onto the ends of his foil roll. "A rat trap," Klaus lied, his voice flat. "The ones under the floorboards are getting loud." Muller watched him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. In the camp, privacy was the ultimate luxury, and secrecy was often mistaken for treason. Finally, Muller scoffed and turned back to his game of cards. "Catch them, then. Just don't let them rot." Klaus exhaled slowly. He connected the makeshift capacitor to the coil he had wound around the cardboard tube earlier. He slotted the vacuum tubes into the holes he had whittled into a piece of scrap wood. It looked like a pile of refuse. But as he soldered the final connection using a heated nail he'd warmed over a candle flame, the circuit closed. The architecture of the device was complete. It was a silent, sleeping machine, waiting for a pulse. Lights out had been called an hour ago. The barracks was a symphony of snores and shifting mattresses, a heavy, suffocating darkness interrupted only by the sweep of the searchlight across the frosted windows. Klaus lay on his stomach, the wool blanket pulled up over his head to form a tent. Inside this stifling cocoon, he arranged his creation. He had traded 3 packs of cigarettes for 4 D-cell flashlight batteries, a steep price that had cost him his lunch rations for a week. He taped them together in a series, creating a fragile spine of voltage. His hands shook as he touched the wire to the terminal. Pop. A sharp crackle echoed in the stolen earpiece pressed deep into his auditory canal. Klaus froze, his eyes darting to the edge of the blanket. Had anyone heard? The man above him shifted, the bed springs groaning like a dying animal, but did not wake. Klaus exhaled and turned the tuning coil. The cat's whisker, a thin wire probing a crystal detector he'd chipped from a piece of lead ore found in the gravel, scratched across the surface. Static. White noise. It sounded like the ocean, or perhaps the distance between Texas and the rest of the world. Then a voice cut through. It wasn't German. It was a rhythmic, fast-paced drawl. "Bringing you the rhythm of the range, right here on K-Tal." Suddenly music flooded the earpiece, brass instruments, a chaotic driving beat that refused to march in step. Swing. Jazz. To the party, this was entartet music, degenerate music, the sound of moral decay. Klaus had been taught to despise it, but in the cold, lonely dark of the prisoner camp, the music didn't feel corrupt. It felt warm. It felt like movement. A trumpet solo climbed higher and higher, defiant and free. Klaus found his foot tapping against the mattress, an involuntary betrayal of his training. Thump. Thump. Boots on the porch steps. The door handle rattled. Klaus ripped the wire from the battery. The music died instantly. He shoved the radio components under his chest, flattening himself against the mattress just as the beam of a flashlight swept the room. "Check. All present," a bored MP muttered. The beam lingered for a second on Klaus's bunk, illuminating the hump of his shoulder. Klaus didn't breathe. He didn't blink. The door closed. The darkness returned. Klaus lay there, his heart racing. He had built a machine that could catch the enemy's joy. But he didn't want joy. He wanted truth. He wanted to know if his house in Cologne was still standing, He needed to reach further than Texas. 3 nights later, the atmosphere shifted. The Texas air turned crisp, and the ionosphere, the invisible mirror in the sky, settled into the perfect density for a long-distance skip. Klaus knew the physics. At night, the sun's radiation faded, allowing radio waves to bounce further around the curvature of the Earth. He extended his antenna, a thin copper strand he had snaked along the metal frame of the cot, effectively turning the entire bed into a receiver. He lay still, the earpiece buzzing like a trapped insect. He bypassed the local jazz stations. He pushed the coil further into these shortwave bands where the signals were thin and ghostly. He hunted for the familiar cadence of the Reichsrundfunk. Suddenly a voice pierced the static. It was faint, drifting in and out like a swimmer in rough water. Our brave forces, the Ardennes, decisive blow against the Anglo-American aggressors. Klaus stopped breathing. It was German, High German, the crisp, authoritative diction of a Berlin broadcaster. The enemy is breaking. Fortress Europe stands firm. Final victory is at hand. Klaus closed his eyes, waiting for the surge of pride, the relief of knowing his sacrifice mattered. But it didn't come. Instead, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He remembered Normandy. He remembered the sky turning black with Allied bombers, the ground shaking for days, the absolute mechanical superiority of the American advance. He looked at the chocolate bar wrapper on the floor, left over from a guard who had dropped it. He looked at the sturdy boots on his feet. The voice in his ear was lying. It was a grotesque realization. Here, in the heart of the enemy territory, he was fed, clothed, and safe. There on the radio, his leaders were sending boys into a meat grinder and calling it a victory. The truth from home sounded like madness. The prison of Texas felt like sanity. The dissonance made him nauseous. He couldn't listen to the lies anymore. He couldn't listen to a war that didn't want to end. With a trembling hand, Klaus adjusted the dial. He didn't want news. He didn't want generals. He wanted to wash the sound of the propaganda out of his head. He turned the knob until the angry voice faded into the Atlantic static, searching for something else, anything that sounded like peace. December 23rd brought a biting wind that rattled the window panes of the barracks. Inside, a different kind of conspiracy was taking shape. It wasn't political. It was culinary. Sugar, Hannes whispered, sliding a small, grease-stained packet across the footlocker. From the Red Cross parcel. I traded my soap for it. Klaus nodded, accepting the contraband. Beside him, Feldwebel Müller, the hardliner who usually scoffed at sentimentality, silently placed a handful of dried raisins on the wood. Even he couldn't resist the pull of Weihnachten, Christmas. They were making Stalin. It was a poor imitation, mixed in a scrubbed-clean steel helmet and baked over a smokeless flame fueled by shoe polish and wood chips. It didn't smell like the bakeries of Dresden, but the scent of heated sugar and yeast was enough to make the men's eyes glaze over with memory. While the dough rose under a coat, Klaus turned his attention back to the machine. He didn't just want to hear the music, he wanted to project it. He took a stiff piece of cardboard from a K-ration box and rolled it into a tight cone. He carefully glued the narrow end to the diaphragm of the stolen earpiece with tree sap he'd scraped from the pines during work detail. It was a primitive loudspeaker, designed to amplify the tiny vibrations into something audible to a room. Will it work? Hannes asked, dusting flour from his hands. It will whisper, Klaus corrected, adjusting the tension on the wire. But in the quiet, a whisper is enough. He wrapped the device in a towel, placing it next to the dense, heavy loaf of cake. They were ready. The plan was to smuggle it to the farm the next day. They would leave the stolen on the miller's porch, a ghost gift from the enemy. Suddenly the door banged open. Sergeant Davis stomped in, stomping snow from his boots. The men froze, bodies shifting to block the view of the helmet and the radio. "Richter, Hannes, Muller," Davis barked, reading from a clipboard. "Gear up." Miller called. "A hard freeze is coming tonight. He needs the citrus trees covered and the heater pots lit. You're working a double shift." The men groaned. Christmas Eve in the freezing mud. But Klaus felt a strange thrill. He looked at the towel-wrapped bundle. They weren't just going to leave a gift on a porch. They were going to be there. The stage was set not for a secret drop, but for a performance. "Jawohl," Klaus said, standing up. He grabbed his coat, sliding the radio deep into the lining. The orchard was a hellscape of orange fog. To save the citrus crop from the hard freeze, the men had lit hundreds of smudge pots, crude oil burners that belched thick, black smoke to blanket the trees in warmth. Klaus coughed, wiping soot from his eyes. The scene was hauntingly familiar. The drifting smoke, the flickering fires, the shadows of men moving with urgency. It looked exactly like the outskirts of Caen after the shelling. But here, they were fighting ice, not shrapnel. On the porch of the farmhouse, Mrs. Miller stood like a statue. She was wrapped in a heavy quilt, a shotgun resting harmlessly but symbolically against the railing. She watched them with cold, hard eyes. Her son was in Belgium. Every German face she saw was a potential murderer of her child. "Keep them lit. Move!" Sergeant Davis yelled, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was 10 minutes to midnight. Klaus found himself near the tractor, parked centrally among the rows. He signaled to Hannes and Muller. They moved to shield him from the porch's line of sight. Klaus placed the radio on the tractor's cold steel hood. He retrieved the cardboard cone speaker from his coat and connected the wires. His fingers were numb, clumsy with the cold. He turned the dial. Static hissed, sharp and loud in the frozen air. Mrs. Miller flinched on the porch. Davis turned around, hand dropping to his holster. "What the hell is—" Then the signal locked. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't news. It was a choir, broadcast from a station in San Antonio, playing a recording from before the war. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." The sound was tinny, filtered through cardboard and copper, but the melody was unmistakable. The effect was instant. Hannes stopped shoveling dirt. Muller straightened his back. Across the yard, Sergeant Davis took his hand off his gun. The German lyrics floated through the black, oily smoke, drifting up to the porch. "Alles schläft, einsam wacht." Klaus watched Mrs. Miller. She stiffened. This was the enemy's language. It should have been hateful. But the melody was Silent Night. It was the same song she had likely sung in her local church hours ago. The cognitive dissonance hung heavy in the air. The monsters in her yard were singing a lullaby to a baby Jesus. Klaus began to hum along, quietly at first. Then Hannes joined in. Then Muller. A low, rumbling baritone chorus rose from the prisoners, mixing with the crackle of the smudge pots. For 3 minutes, there was no war in Brazos County. There was only the cold, the fire, and a song that belonged to no army. As the final note faded into the static, Klaus switched off the device. The silence that rushed back in was louder than the music had been. He looked up at the porch. Mrs. Miller was no longer looking at them with hate. She was looking at them with a devastating, confusing grief. She turned and walked into the house without a word. The sun began to bleed a pale, bruised purple over the horizon, signaling the end of the shift. The smudge pots had burned down to glowing embers, leaving the orchard smelling of diesel and damp earth. The citrus trees were safe. Klaus disconnected the speaker wire with trembling fingers. The magic of the night was fading, replaced by the stark reality of morning. He was still a prisoner. The radio was still contraband. He wrapped the device in his coat, preparing to climb back into the transport truck. "Wait!" a voice called out. It wasn't Davis. It was Mr. Miller. The old farmer walked slowly across the frozen mud, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. He stopped 3 feet from Klaus. He looked at the bundle under Klaus's arm, then up at his face. Klaus braced himself. He expected anger. He expected a demand to hand it over. Instead, Miller reached into his heavy shearling jacket. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a thermos. He unscrewed the cap, steam rising in the cold air, and poured a cup of black coffee. He held it out, not to the guard, but to Klaus. My boy wrote that he heard that song in Belgium, Miller said, his voice rough like gravel. Said the Germans were singing it across the lines. Klaus took the cup. The heat burned his fingers, a welcome pain. It is a universal song, Herr Miller. Miller nodded, his eyes drifting to the hidden shape of the radio. That Philco, I told you to burn it 3 weeks ago. It was broken, Klaus admitted, his throat tight. And now it sings, Miller finished. He looked at Klaus with a new appraisal, not as a soldier of the Reich, but as a man who could fix broken things, a man who built instead of destroyed. Klaus remembered the package in his own pocket. He reached in and pulled out the stolen, wrapped in wax paper. It was dense, heavy, and smelled faintly of wood smoke. For the lady, Klaus said, offering it. It is not perfect, but it is traditional. Miller took the cake. He weighed it in his hand, a small smile cracking his weathered face. He reached into his pocket again and tossed a pack of Lucky Strikes onto the tractor hood. Merry Christmas, Klaus. Frohe Weihnachten, Mr. Miller. Klaus climbed into the back of the truck. As the engine roared to life and they pulled away, he didn't look at the barbed wire awaiting him at Camp Hearne. He looked at the antenna wire coiled in his lap. He had come here to fight a war, but in the crawl space of a Texas barracks, he had found something else. He had tuned out the noise of the world and found the frequency of a human being.